Let's get started. Thank you all for joining us today. We are really excited to dive in and talk about the ways that CFOs approach navigating cross-functional leadership in today's world. We're sitting down with current and former execs from CFGI, Brooklyn Boulders, Spinn, Ring, and Made Renovation, and we're really excited to learn about everything that they have to share with us today. Ali, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So this webinar is going to be recorded. We will send the playback of our conversation today to everyone who registered. So please feel free to participate in the chat if you have any additional questions. And this will also be published as in podcast form as well for those who like to listen along. So feel free to pop out if you need to, but enjoy the conversation. And I will pass the microphone to Anish, our founder and CEO here at Ruckus.
Hi, everybody. My name is Anish. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York. My background was helping to run marketing and growth for different companies and ended up stumbling randomly into building an executive search firm. We focus on working with a ton of different startups across the globe, focused on VP and C-level roles generally. And yeah, we're a team of 17 now worldwide.
Oh, this is me. I'm Gladys. Thank you so much for hosting the webinar today, Anish. I'm Gladys. I'm the CFO for Spinn. I was also the former VP of Finance at Ring. I've been working in startup, for over 20 years now. I'm a licensed CPA. I'm from Hong Kong originally, and I've been living in the States for over 20 years. And I also worked in China for about 4 years. I also worked in Amsterdam and Sweden. So I'm extremely happy to be, on the panel today.
Hey everybody, I'm Shane. Delighted to be here and hosting this panel with my fellow panelists, Gladys and Ari. Thanks to Anish for putting it on. Similar to Gladys, I've got international experience. I started out with the Big Four in Dublin, Ireland, as you may or may not be able to tell from my watered down accent. Spent a few years living in New Zealand, heading up finance for the biggest ski company in the country over there. Relocated to the States with my now wife, who's American. Spent a couple of years working in private equity, doing a lot of kind of startup investment, assessment, structuring deals, managing a portfolio of internal companies. From there, I moved into VP of Finance, progressed into CFO with Brooklyn Boulders, one of the nation's kind of foremost indoor rock climbing and fitness companies. From there, we ended up kind of after COVID going through a series of strategic exits. And since then, I've been working, or actually, sorry, just recently started as a director with CFGI, which is a big time management consulting and financial consulting firm. So looking forward to getting into some of the media discussion with you guys.
Hey everyone, looking forward to this discussion. So my name is Hari. I've similar to Gladys and Shane, I started work in another country. This is back in India, and I started work at the Big Four. Moved to the US for B school after that, went on to work at a couple of large companies, Cummins and Walmart being those companies, and then moved on to the startup world too. I worked at around 3 startups now, had a combination of finance and operational roles. And yeah, excited to be here, excited to talk about what cross-functional leadership looks like.
Awesome. And Hari's very modest. He's a very well-respected CFO who is, we work with very closely with one of our clients, and he's building a fractional business. So for all of you who need to rent a CFO, he's a perfect option for you. And so for all the folks who RSVP'd, they were asked to enter a question to ask our panel of experts. We've pulled out the most interesting of the questions and put them here for all of us to discuss. We may not get to all of the questions, so apologies if we don't. And if anyone in the audience wanted to ask something within the chat, we could do our best to try to answer it if it's a fairly succinct question. So starting off, what, in your experiences, and anyone can answer, in your experiences, what are the most important considerations for the financial leader of a fast-growing company? If you're about to hire a CFO for your organization, number one, what is the right time? What are you looking for? And what is the right time to start looking for that person? And also, who do you want in that role? When you're interviewing for that role, what are you looking for? Is it just the right experience, in accounting and finance, or are there other kind of intangibles or tangibles that you're sort of looking for? So sort of a two-part question. When's the right time to start looking for a CFO, and what exactly are you looking for in the most ideal hires? And it could be even more junior than a CFO, your first hire, maybe even a director of finance, whoever the first financial leader might be of an organization.
I can start off. I'd love to hear the others weigh into. So in finance leadership roles in fast-growing companies, right? And I'll focus on startups for now because that's the bulk of my recent experience. I feel like there's a few things you want your finance team to do well. The first is helping channel the energy that comes with high growth in the right direction. Second is risk management. Third is making sure you're developing a well-rounded set of metrics so the company is always looking at the right things as they grow, and make sure those metrics evolve over time as the company grows through. I'll dig into those a little bit in detail there. So with the first one, it's channeling energy. The one thing I love about startups is how much energy there is, how much energy growth brings, and how everyone around you is doing things they haven't done before, looking for ways to do it that haven't been experimented on before too. As a CFO, as a finance leader, you want to avoid saying no too much. You want to avoid saying yes too much. You want to make sure that you're helping people get to their goals while minimizing risk. And that brings me to my second point too, which is risk mitigation. Make sure the company is taking the right risks, not the wrong ones, making sure you're taking risks that help you build a sustainable business and not the other way around. The third and finally is metrics. Not really a lot to say there, but helping define this is one of the key things a finance team can do well. So that'd be a third focus too.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And I think one of the feedback points that I'd gotten about Hari of you and your roles is that, compared to other CFOs, you're not just saying no. And I think the CFO role often gets a bad reputation of just your job is just saying no to every single thing, instead of coming up with ideas to how do you grow the organization instead of just cutting and cutting. So I think it's really refreshing to hear you say, no, you have to know when to say yes and when to say no, and be pretty balanced and thoughtful in that.
I think exactly to that point, Anish, to piggyback on some of the things Hari mentioned, I think having a willingness to take risk is critical, but to be able to take risks with discipline and foresight is definitely a big part of the role that CFO plays for a growing startup or a fast growing company at any level. Typically CEOs or founders tend to be more visionary in nature, and that's a great thing. I mean, that's generally what tends to bring companies from the ground all the way up to where they grow to. But I think it is important to be able to take risks, but to be able to do it with discipline, as I mentioned. And there's a lot of ways to think through that, right? It's a lot of thoughtful, detailed planning, understanding what the marketplace looks like, understanding what the competitive landscape looks like, so that you don't dive into something without the ability to understand exactly where that dive is taking you, and ensure that you have the right tools, infrastructure, and sort of supporting resources around you. With that in mind, to your other point, Anish, about kind of having the reputation of always just saying no. That's another balance that's really important to strike. I mean, cash is king in a growing startup, so you want to be very intentional about your spending or any new initiatives that you take on. But it's also important to kind of make sure that you're embodying the spirit that you want to see within a growing startup or an entrepreneurial environment. For me, that often takes the form of ensuring, when it comes to, say, competing initiatives for any given budget resources, for example. In case you'll remember this from our time of working together with Brooklyn Boulders. I like to think about the idea of an idea meritocracy. So in growing startups, it tends to be a lot of creative thinkers. There tends to be a lot of people with high energy and a lot of great ideas. A lot of the times you're limited as you're growing by the amount of actually capital resources available to you, and you need to be really thoughtful and intentional about how you spend that. So to avoid the perspective of potentially the CFO coming across as the no man instead of the yes man or the enabler, you can develop tools and infrastructure to help bring the best ideas to the top, or help prioritize ideas for an executive team about when the right timing is to potentially go after a certain initiative or spend certain budget dollars. So there's a lot of interesting pieces, and I've intentionally kind of focused the last 10, 12, 14 years of my career in that kind of smaller to mid-sized company space for exactly the thing that you need to embrace the most, which is change and dynamism. To me, that is super rewarding. It makes my day-to-day very interesting, but it's also very difficult. And a lot of people aren't as welcoming or open to change. So being as a personal financial leader, being resilient, being ready for change, and actually embracing that in your day-to-day, I think is critical too. And not in any way be resistant. And there's a whole separate toolkit that I'm sure we'll get into later about how to best prepare yourself for change and to kind of take the organization through change management.
That's really interesting. Thanks for that. And you mentioned there's certain tools to even figure out how to how to absorb ideas, understand what is the best, what are the best things to move forward. Is that similar to sort of product management in terms of like an ICE ranking system, understanding the cost, understanding the effort, understanding the time, or are there things that are unique to finance that are in that toolkit?
Well, I can give one example, and I think the toolkit really needs to vary depending on the needs, right, and the circumstances or the organizational variables. For me, one that comes to mind, at the end of the day, like we had a really talented director, executive, and sort of top leadership team at Brooklyn Boulders, and we were in rapid scaling mode. There was a million ideas, all really, really strong ones, but we were limited by resources. So to enable people to make sure that they all felt that they had a fair crack at the ability to kind of come up with the best idea to gain access to those resources, we effectively had our senior leadership kind of create business cases around any new ideas, and particularly ones that were more of a need to actually spend dollars than maybe something that was like a new idea around a new, revenue generating line of business. So with that in mind, we have had a comprehensive business case process. So in terms of a tool, then we also had a sort of a prioritization mechanism where we tried to ascertain the business value of any given new initiative. And we came up with a series of lenses that were effectively organizational KPIs. And then the executive team would have to harness those lenses to effectively apply them to each given business case or initiative. So that's kind of found in the principle of idea meritocracy. We didn't want any one thing to kind of just have the best thing because it was the newest or freshest thing or the last thing that might have caught the CEO's ear. And the idea was that each executive was independently effectively assess each new initiative so that there was a balanced perspective being brought to the table. And we were avoiding groupthink or any sort of confirmation bias. So that's just one sort of framework or methodology that I've applied in the past that I found to be very effective. And ultimately it resulted in sort of like a rank ordered backlog of initiatives that eventually we may want to take down, but to do it thoughtfully in the right order.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And Gladys, any thoughts on either of those kind of two angles? One, what's a great time to kind of bring a financial leader into an organization? And then also, what are you looking for if you are at that point where you want to hire a head of finance?
Yeah, I think those are, I have to agree with, Hari and Shane. I think that, the best timing to hire, a CFO is when you're really raising a big round, or we are trying to like diversify our revenue streams. And we need to have a senior leadership in a financial perspective to make sure that, we have the financial projections in place and be a leader that can collaborate with other departments so that, we can understand, the pros and cons to launching a new business, new revenue streams, etc. In my experiences, being a startup CFO for the last 10 years, I tend to see most hiring of CFO in like the B round and C round. That's when the money starts coming in. We really have to do a good capital allocation. In terms of like, what things to consider, to hire a CFO, me being a CFO, the one thing I keep telling myself is cash is king. So in any situations that I go
Shane
to,
agrees.
yeah, in 100% of, all the time when I go in to see a new, my new client or my, or my new employer, the first thing is to really have a good understanding about the cash in and cash out of the business. And this is one critical area that I need someone that if I hire a CFO that need to have that kind of skill set to really understand, what is the cash burn of the business, to really understand, given the current state of the economy, how can we apply the capital appropriately and strategically so that, we, basically make the best decisions with the company. And I'm also looking for someone that can collaborate with other teams. Working in a startup, things are constantly moving around, and we need to have a good rapport with the rest of the team so that, other teams don't see that, finance team always say no. We have to work with them to really understand, the rationale behind the spend, the rationale about the business objective, and ultimately the CFO is responsible, from a financial perspective to make sure we always have cash that we can spend and we have a financial stability of the organization. So having said that, those are the things I look for, when it comes to the timing to hire a CFO and the qualification to be a good CFO.
Yeah, that's a great point, Gladys. I had that one written down too about cash being king. It's absolutely paramount. the end of the day, most startups are going through cycles of raising money, whether that be equity capital, support with debt, or something in between. And exactly having a laser-like focus on your cash burn, your runway, and knowing all the different levers of the kind of cash ins and outs. If you don't have mastery of that, and you make sure that the rest of your founder or executive team is the same, you could be setting yourself up for failure. So it's absolutely critical for any startup or any growing business.
I like what you said about timing to it. I think the bringing on a CFO when you raise to large round makes sense, because one key value a CFO adds is in allocating resources efficiently. You want to have the right expertise for that.
And it's interesting. So bringing on a CFO when you're raising a round, I think Gladys, you mentioned a B round. Is the idea that the finances aren't necessarily that complex until you get to that stage, and it can be managed a little bit more easily, maybe with sort of like a third party, basic accounting firm or something like that. And then that at that B stage is when, oh, wow, okay, now it's getting really complicated. We have to issue shares. There's a lot of employees. Walk me through like what a startup should do, like kind of in an earlier stage, and then like what gets really complex around the Series B stage.
Yeah, I can talk a bit more about that, Anish. I've been working in startup, for over 10 years now, close to about 12 years. The experiences that I have had is that, in the A round, a lot of times, the founder, the CEO would be doing the finance work, but it gets complex, once we have, more funding comes in, and you need to start, building a relationship with investors. Especially, once we raise, let's say A round to B round, we start, thinking about, well, should we do equipment financing? Should we do AR factoring? Should we bring on debt, from Silicon Valley Bank or Triple Point or Trinity? So it gets into complex because we want to make sure that, our balance sheet, is structured such that, we still have a nice balance sheet. It gets complex in the sense that, the founders, the CEO may not have the best understanding about, the accounting financials, how do we, the best to structure the balance sheet. I think as the capital, comes in from different sources and start thinking about the capital allocation becoming more complex, that's when it's the best time to bring on a CFO on a full-time basis to really assess, the current state of the business, and to provide expertise, to the CEO, to the board, to the management team as to, again, capital allocations. How do we make sure that, we don't burn off the cash, have a very, very tight and have a very, very strong cash forecast. And then to also build out different scenario, as we go through different phases of growth mode, we may have a growth case that we are going to hit 100% of our KPI metrics, or we may have a conservative case that what if we only hit 50%? Do we still have cash to survive? As the work becomes more complex, that's really time to bring on a CFO. And in my experiences, I see that a lot of CFO as a full-time basis really come in the B round. That's when the operations get more complex. That's when we need to have a better understanding about the balance sheet management.
Awesome. Thanks for that.
I think one qualifier at that is that it's useful as a startup to have access to high quality finance advice at any point. The question is, do you want it to be full-time or not? And especially now, right, where the focus is shifting somewhat from saying that you raise one round and the objective is to get to the next round, to saying each round you raise could potentially be your last for an unforeseeable amount of time. And how do you make the best use of it? And I think a good finance leader can play a pretty valuable role there in figuring that out.
Yeah. And as a financial consultant, you yourself could probably tell a company, actually, it's not the right time to hire someone like me, but bring someone on like me 5 hours a week to just help clean things up and fix areas where you're not strong. So I think that's that. Even in marketing and growth, I think it's a great strategy. When someone just raised a C or is getting into their early Series A, you don't need to build out a full marketing and growth team. You just need people to experiment and get in there and get some early learnings and wins. And then you build out a team based off of the early learnings and wins. And probably finance might be a little bit of the same, where you just need some basic accounting help, some like basic FP&A help, but eventually it's going to get complicated. So I think I really appreciate your thoughtful answer there, Gladys. It was very thorough. We can jump on the next one. Yeah. And how do you see the role of the CFO evolving over the next few years? I think we all have this idea of like this very stiff kind of person that the CFO originally was. And I think the CFO role is evolving. And as kind of all of you have noted, is able to understand and absorb the ideas of risk and experimenting and going beyond just being someone to cut costs all day. But how do all of you see it kind of going in the future? Is it absorbing more and more functions within the organization? Is the way to approach the job successfully changing? Is technology is becoming a lot more advanced? But yeah, would love to learn.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question for everyone to consider. I think if you're not thinking about it, you're going to get left behind, first and foremost. One maybe recent way of describing a CFO is the wingman to the CEO. I think that's never been truer, and that the traditional view of CFO is just the person who has a mastery of the accounting and finance functions is effectively defunct at this point. I think if that's the way that you characterize yourself, you need to start thinking a lot more broadly. And I think to your point of absorbing roles, that's sort of circumstantial. It really depends on the kind of size, scope, and scale of an organization. But I think any CFO who's looking to really take the next step or be kind of future ready really needs to start thinking about rounding themselves out across the board for all the kind of critical elements of the organization. It doesn't mean you need to be a master at everything, but you really need to have a good command of all of the kind of key functions and departments within your organization from an executive leadership perspective. I think you touched on technology transformation. Obviously, that is at the forefront of everyone's minds right now. So many of the old processes or infrastructure or the way that things were done within a finance team are being fundamentally reshapen as we speak. There's a new tool out there, I feel like every single day, to optimize, expedite, or fundamentally transform any given process, tool, system, or interrelationship between all of those within a given finance team. So it's really important that you're constantly looking to up-level yourself, seeking out new information, seeking out new knowledge, joining professional groups, whatever the thing might be, to make sure that you're at the forefront of any of the new information or any of the new ways of doing things that might happen, might impact your organization. It's just critical to really be that forward-looking thinker and to be looking for all the sources of information to best set yourself up for success in that regard. There's a lot more to be said about that, but I want to pause to make sure everyone else gets a chance to contribute.
We have time, so by all means, no, that's really helpful. I like the part that you mentioned learning other cross-functional areas, and yeah, I think people are relying on the CFO these days to do more from the strategic standpoint and explain how each of these different functions can grow intelligently. But how do you get there to be smart enough with all of those different areas? Does it just come from collaborating with those teams and absorbing, asking questions, or are you doing your own studies on the side to understand how product management works, how marketing works, what are the evolutions of funding? How are you growing beyond just, obviously all of you have a lot of baseline, all of you worked in Big Four earlier on in your career, so the baseline of finance is there, but how are you teaching yourself to do more, to, as you say, be a better CFO and be more of a cross-functional leader?
I can take another quick stab at that. I mean, look, at the end of the day, you need to have a constant thirst for knowledge. I think for anybody who's looking to be at the leadership at any level in an organization, you need to have a kind of fundamental and constant thirst for knowledge. And that goes from any source to your question, Anish. I mean, that's definitely spending time and collaborating with other executives and other functional teams within your organization. That's a great source of information, particularly as it relates to that kind of inward look. But for me, I look across the spectrum, whether it be reading books in areas outside of my kind of functional area. I mean, I've read a ton of finance books, as you can imagine, but reading other interesting kind of executive leadership books focused on marketing or IT transformation or the latest trends in data analytics. It's just important that you're looking to round yourself out while also maintaining a focus on the key elements of your job at the same time, right? It's all a balance. But for me, I mean, it's everything from the daily newspaper or sources of news that you read all the way through to, what's the latest book or set of goals that you're looking to kind of round yourself out on or look for that kind of next leveling up. So I think it's just a case of trying to find the right balance of all of the different areas where you can seek out that information. I think internally in the organization is a great place to start. Spend time with the other leaders in the organization, understand exactly what it is they do, what makes them tick, what it is that really pulls the levers for their functional department to effectively align with the organization's goals. But in terms of personally developing yourself, it's critical that you're always looking at yourself and self-reflecting in that regard too, and seeking out things just in a personal capacity as well as an organizational one.
Well, that I like that you throw in like a self-reflection angle at the end as well. It's not just reading books and learning from others. It's okay, what am I good at? What am I bad at? That's really helpful. Any other thoughts about, how the role of the CFO has been, evolving over or will be evolving over the next few years?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because it comes up all the time, right? I'd like to argue against the premise of it a bit though. There's this thing in technology called the Lindy effect, which says that the longer something's been around, the larger its life expectancy is. And that I think that applies in some ways to roles at the highest level too. To where if you look at what a CFO needs to do, I don't think it's changed a lot since the role came into existence. And the way I define it, right, if there's one thing a CFO does, it's owning the map to a business. This is not an original thought. It's something I read in a blog that Ben Horowitz wrote that stuck with me. But what it means is that if we start with defining what a CEO does, a CEO brings in the vision for the company. The CEO says you're at point X now. As a company, you need to get to point Y. A CFO needs to chart out the map that shows the company, shows all of its stakeholders how you get from point X to point Y. You need to be able to explain that well to those stakeholders too. And I feel like everything a CFO does revolves around that one thing, whether it's building a great team that helps report on transactions and explain performance, whether it's building a narrative that resonates with investors, whether it's supporting your executive team. It comes back to that one thing. And I don't see that changing significantly really over any point in time, as long as you have CFOs.
That's fair. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Any thoughts from your end, Gladys?
Yeah, I can speak a bit more about some of my experiences. I think that in the next few years, I think communication is going to be key for the CFO. The reason I say that, we have, as you can see that, at startup scale, we're going to have a lot more cross-functional collaboration. And a lot of those stakeholders in the other departments outside of finance may not really understand financial terminology. So in that sense, we have to really build out our communication skills and be able to really illustrate our financial data to non-financial, stakeholders, maybe by making the graph, by able to clearly explain, the numbers, by making the chart, basically trying to involve all the stakeholders in the organization to understand, why finance is critical in the organizations, and also help other team members to drive decisions. So communications is more important than ever. The second thing is like Hari and Shane both touch upon technology expertise. I agree with that. Nowadays, everybody's talking about ChatGPT, and we need to really understand that, artificial intelligence, data analytics, machine learning, even blockchain, that can actually help us to save costs in the long term. So I think that finance leaders need to be proactive and to learn about what's going on, not just in the finance industry, but just in general economy, how we can really navigate changes, in the future. The other areas that I see that, that CFO being evolving in the next couple of years is to be flexible. Economy is constantly changing, variables are constantly changing. We have to be adaptable and be flexible about change. And I think that, having the collaboration with, different team members, understanding about the latest technology, ideas, and be data driven. A lot of times the other stakeholders in the organizations, because they're not finance, they're not backed by numbers, they may navigate decisions based on, ideas. And as a finance, professional, we have to be very objective. We have to state the facts, but we also have to apply data analytics to make sure that we can justify the decisions we're going. So, having a good, rapport with different stakeholders, being able to communicate, being able to mitigate any financial risk. I think those are going to be the key elements when we look for, in an evolving CFO in the next couple of years.
I like that. That's great. And you also talked about changing conditions, right? Which obviously we're going through right now. You also talked about communication. I think two of our future questions are around both of that. And so we'll dig deeper into both of those in a bit. We can jump to the next one.
Just before you move on, I think it was interesting you brought up Chat GPT, because it's actually come up twice in a sort of professional and personal capacity over the last week. So anecdotally, I was hanging out with a VP of marketing friend of mine recently, and he was talking about how, marketing people tend to do a lot of surveying, understanding their customer, whether it's their internal customer or their external customer. And he has to explain what, several thousand survey results. He was able to just plug in Chat GPT and spit out all the key themes from that. And then secondarily, I was speaking to a former controller of mine about a new business idea he has. He's looking to potentially become an entrepreneur. And he was talking about, external accounting firms, and how if you really know the right way to build an infrastructure, you can almost automate the entire close process these days. And if you think back 5-10 years ago, a huge part of the CFO's job or the top financial leader's job was managing the close process. These days, with the advent of technology, new automations, and all the new tools available to us, it's possible that you can get that close to like fully automated. So you really have to understand where the next step of your role is going to evolve to, and make sure that you're harnessing the things that you don't get left behind too. Because if all the other companies, figured out how to do a 2 or 3 day close, and you're still looking at a 20 or 30 day close, well, there's probably things that you need to learn or look for new tools to harness and bring to bear.
I think that's really great. And I think the finance profession is often thought of one that doesn't need to advance as aggressively and rapidly as others. That's just the way I might have a thought that might be an incorrect thought. Just that, finance hasn't evolved that much over time in terms of the requirements of the role, in terms of what you're doing on a monthly basis and a quarterly basis and an annual basis. But what you're saying is, no, now it might be, and people need to really catch up. I think marketing definitely is one that advances aggressively every year or two in terms of what people can and can't do, and what's going to actually be successful. And that's why some marketers who haven't actually decided to invest their energy in learning new technologies and new methodologies and talking to all of your peers regularly to see what's working, what isn't working, they can tend to be left behind. But now you're saying, okay, finance, you got to do the same thing, because there's a chance you can be left behind by all the new tools of automation. And so that's really interesting. That's kind of contrary to what I'd originally thought about the profession. So it's good to hear that everyone's got to evolve. That's kind of the fun of taking on these challenges, right?
Absolutely.
And Gladys, you touched upon kind of the importance of communicating complex financial information to folks who are not nearly as educated as you are in them. So you talked to the importance of doing it. Now, how do you do it? Are there any tips and tricks on how you've been able to effectively do that?
I would say that, let me, since you're addressing that to me, I'm going to make sure that Shane and Harry have a chance to talk as well.
Of course.
I think from my perspective, I think it draws on 3 things, to really have effective communication skills. First of all, it takes experiences, and it also takes practice and patience. I think it's extremely crucial that, CFO to build a rapport with our stakeholders. I think that we need to invest time really to help others to learn, what finance does, why financial information are so critical in an organization. In all my companies, I always build out the KPI, and those are the key metrics of the organization. And I make it very clear, very crisp, and make sure that, the stakeholders really understand how we are performing. We track that against the benchmark in the industry, and we also track that against, our forecast. So, I would start from simple terms first. In my experiences, I don't really use any technical jargon. I make sure that, I can communicate this information to anybody in the company, not just anybody, but anybody that I meet, on the street. I want to make sure that I use very easy languages to help them understand the financial data. And I also focus on the key metrics. So instead of telling the entire financial story, I focus on the key elements, the KPI. That way, when I talk about, let's say the CAC, the return on investment, acquisition cost, those are the things that, the stakeholders can really easily understand, because we're talking about the same things. And then a part of my job is to also build out presentation charts and graphs. At my current company, previous companies, our founders are technology driven. They are engineers, they are designers. So they may not have the best, the financial perspective, to understand the entire financial landscape. So I build out the chart, I build out the graph to make sure that, all stakeholders can really easily to understand the data that I'm illustrating. And I also highlight the key trends. And that way, I make sure that there are some key elements, of the presentation that they need to stay on top of that. And then last but not least is to really provide the context, to really tell the customers and tell the stakeholders, tell the shareholders and also tell our investors, the whole rationale, why we're doing that, and what is the financial result. And if it's good or bad, I will illustrate both good and bad because we want to build rapport with our stakeholders. And we also want to build, honesty with our stakeholders as well.
I think that resonates pretty well with me. I feel like effective communication ultimately needs a lot of prep work. There's a tendency sometimes in finance to think that numbers can speak for themselves. They often don't, because people come in with different perspectives, different biases, different amounts of time they spent with those numbers. So I think it's really important to craft a narrative to begin with and bring people into that narrative and feed your numbers into that narrative as you go along. But importantly, as you do that, be very clear about the assumptions you're making, the conclusions you're drawing, and how confident or not you feel about them. Allow people to challenge those assumptions. I think that's probably how you add the most value as a financial leader, by building the story around the numbers, helping people understand it, and then having a discussion around it.
That's great. Yeah. And I think the difference between anybody the difference between anybody great who's in anything numbers oriented or quantitatively oriented isn't necessarily how great they are at math or how great they are at actually crunching the numbers or how fast they are at it. It's, can you pull out the stuff that actually matters to whomever you're speaking with and focus on that and understand what your audience actually cares about? And I've noticed that with a lot of analytics leaders and a lot of finance leaders, sometimes that's tough for them to do. And they'll go through every single detail, hoping almost in an academic way, like the way you would write a paper in college. You want to include every single piece of information just in case you don't miss something, instead of saying, okay, you as this stakeholder, here's the 3 things you care about. Here's what I learned. Here's the insight about these 3 things. Now let's go into that. And to me, it's the major differentiator. And it's something that's frankly not taught either in academia or probably early on in someone's career as they are taking on accounting. It's really the differentiator between people at the VP and C level. Can you speak about what the audience actually cares about and nothing else? So yeah, I like that you really pointed that out to synthesize to just the things that they care about.
I think that's a great point. I think that needs to be at the forefront of any kind of data visualization exercise too, so that you are really focusing and honing in on the key elements of the data, and whether that's board reporting or figuring out the right way to communicate financial information, key performance indicators to frontline sales teams. So I think you're raising a great point, Anish. So it's really about knowing who your target audience is for any given financial data set, report, metrics, data dashboard. So I think really identifying the key user groups within your organization and understanding as a CFO or a finance team, generally speaking, how the right way or the best way to communicate information to any of those different user groups is. A couple of quick anecdotes might be, for example, a sales manager or a frontline sales team. Like, do they need to know all the ins and outs of how you think about depreciating your fixed asset roster? No, they don't need to know about that. They don't need to know about goodwill impairment or anything like that either, right? They need to understand what are the key building blocks that drive organizational success. Do they need to be able to harness? Do they need to be able to wrap their arms around? A lot of the time, that's a set of KPIs or a set of sales targets or goals that they can understand. However, I do think it's also important to be able to paint the big picture for folks, particularly at a management rank, whether it's lower management, middle management, or directors or executives, that they can have a good understanding. And Gladys made a great point here earlier on about help them understand the why, right? If you just paint a picture of a whole P&L and you focus in on EBITDA and a bunch of complicated financial terms that some of these folks may not have a good grasp of, you're not really communicating the why. If you can get to the frontline sales team and help them understand the building blocks of traffic, conversion rates, churn, sales targets, and help them understand how their day-to-day efforts actually contribute to the bigger picture, I think that's really, really fundamentally important. And then, another take on that might be a different team. Let's say a development team, right? At Brooklyn Boulders, we were building $5 to $8 million large-scale construction projects. it's a completely different set of financial information that these guys need to have a firm grasp of. And it's also a two-way street, right? There's a whole different language when it comes to the construction, architecture, design world that a lot of CFOs may or may not be familiar with. So understanding kind of your audience, being able to meet them where they are, but also identifying the right balance between, I suppose, meeting them where they are and also up-leveling any given user group in an organization, a strategic leader. It's an important balance to be able to understand and kind of approach the right way.
Absolutely. It's not terribly dissimilar from marketing when you're trying to put some information out to your audience. I believe in like headlines and glossaries, in big bold print, 2-3 sentences that you want someone to take away from whatever you're putting in front of them. And then if they want more details, they can read down to the glossary. They can get back to that area, but you shove it to the bottom so that that audience doesn't get lost. And I'd imagine the way you communicate financial information is fairly similar. The 3 big things I want you to know and walk away from this. And then, yeah, okay, if you have more questions, if you want more details, here it is buried down here. Feel free to read that if you want. Cool. Any additional comments on that?
Yeah, just one other thing I wanted to mention in terms of sort of a framework that I've found to be really beneficial in the past is like a peer-to-peer training framework or system if you can build that. So think about leaders all across an organization, right? Not just finance leaders. Obviously, there's a need for financial leaders to be able to communicate and ensure there's good literacy across the organization for all their key reporting, all their key elements. But it goes across the organization too. Casey, for example, as a marketing leader, or maybe yourself, Anish, and there's a lot of concepts within marketing or sales funnel that may or may not be top of mind or fully understood, for other leaders within the organization. So I found setting up sort of like a peer-to-peer leadership forum within an organization is a great way to knowledge share. It also builds culture. It's a great way for leaders to get exposed to each other's day-to-day or strategic focuses, but also it's that kind of like cross-functional literacy that you're just developing that harmoniously within the organization, allowing people to kind of establish themselves as leaders and kind of afford them that opportunity to kind of demonstrate their knowledge set and help other leaders make sure that they understand that at a granular level. It's something that we did really effectively at NZ Ski, the big ski company in New Zealand that I worked at. They had a fantastic leadership training and leadership development program. And they involved everyone from middle managers all the way to executives in a kind of a knowledge sharing forum capacity. And I found it to be really positive and really effective.
How does that work? Is it just basically taking people from disparate groups and setting them up for meetings to talk about what they do and what their challenges are and how their job works? Or
yeah, that's one element. A lot of the time you actually pick a specific topic too. For example, I mean, okay. I led a leadership training on just 3 financial statements, understanding and modeling. A lot of folks that might understand the P&L at a granular level may have no idea how a cash flow statement works, for example. So that's just one example, right? And then a marketing leader might have talked about a new digital marketing campaign or the best way to harness e-commerce tools. So more often than not, it would be a functional leader would pick a particular topic. But I mean, this was a series that, ran over the course of several years. So it kind of just deepened and kind of evolved and sort of self-generated over time. But yeah, it was like you'd identify a cohort of functional leaders, whether, as I said, kind of that middle manager up to executive, and make sure that they all had like a periodic opportunity to participate in these forums and have kind of functional knowledge up leveling, but also sort of knowledge sharing too. So it was a little bit of an iterative format. It wasn't always one size fits all, but I just found it as a really cool culture building and kind of leadership development tool.
Yeah, I would have loved that because I still don't know how a cash flow statement works. So that would have been really helpful to meet someone like you. Cool. Any other thoughts on effective communication?
I think I liked what Shane said about education. It's important in so many ways when you're engaging with the rest of the company. For example, right, a lot of times when I've led cost savings initiatives, I've found it works so much better if you're able to bring people along on what your unit economics are, what needs to change and why and by when. You end up getting ideas you wouldn't have thought of yourself as a finance team. You end up getting cooperation beyond what you'd expected if you're willing to take people along on the journey. So I think that's really useful to do.
I really like that. It's how you can get a better reputation is not just being the no person. It's effective communication, right? You're not saying, oh no, you're not allowed to spend that. You're saying, okay, look, here's where we are as a company. Here's how much money we have. Here's how much money we'll be spending over the next month. You see the gap here? Let's try to be better at this gap right here where we'd like to make more money and not lose this much money. And then they can help come up with some of their own solutions instead of just being like, and I think it might just be people in those traditional CFO roles don't want to communicate at that level. It's just not fun for them to have to to go into that level of detail. But I think the modern, going back to the earlier question, the modern CFO has to take that time to be a better communicator and learn those skills. So it's great to hear. But I can imagine the patience from your end of having to teach things that you probably learned very clearly, 1 year out of college, to people who are in pretty senior level roles. So I understand it does take patience from all of your ends.
This is I think I read somewhere that says you only truly understand something when you teach it to someone else. I found that to be true.
Yeah, absolutely. Teaching is the only way to mastery. Cool. Let's jump to the next one. We have a lot of people on this call who are varying levels of seniority. Many are starting their career in finance, many are mid-level. And I think throughout this call, you've all talked about the CFO role is pretty advanced and has to really understand a lot of different areas within the organization to be able to effectively partner with them. Also has to, be a great communicator in explaining things to people of a variety of difficulty levels. But what would you say, like, what's helped you in your path to get up to the levels that you've been able to get up to? And to the next person who asks, how do I get up to your level?
I can go first. I'd love to hear from the others too here.
Yeah.
For me, one thing that's worked for me consistently is being willing to step out of your lane, especially when you're earlier on in your career.
Step out of your what?
Step out of your lane. Do things that you wouldn't typically do as part of your day-to-day role. Look for problems that no one's solving. Don't care as much about which function they're in or who owns solving it. Put your hand up, try to solve them. Look for opportunities that get you to do things you haven't done before, because that's how you round out your experience. If I look at every success I've had in my career, it's come from something like that. I was at a role at Teespring, one of my previous companies, where I was leading up finance. I had the opportunity to take on the operations team too, having never done it before. I took it up and learned so much from that. It's something I draw on even today. Beyond that, I went on to work at a Korean beauty company that Gladys and I were just chatting about, because she worked there for a while too. Half my team spoke Korean and I didn't know how to talk to them, but learning how to navigate those cultural differences made me a better leader too. So I'd say always look for things that you haven't done before, and the roads will find you.
Yeah, I love that. I think the quickest way for anyone to limit their career is to say, no, this is my job. That's not my job. That's someone else's job. I don't think it helps anyone move forward in their organization and get promoted or grow in any meaningful way. But it's something you hear really regularly within an organization where people say, like, no, don't come to me for that. So
that's a great way to get a big old black mark next to your name in an organization to say that's not my job, it's someone else's job. I can tell you that for sure.
Yeah. And I think it's also how people grow to the C level, right? Those people who say that, and it might be that's right for them for their career and their ambition level, right? They want to stay in that particular lane. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with that. But for folks who want to get up higher, you've got to be able to take on more and have not be disturbed when you're asked to. But yeah, would love to learn more, as people are trying to grow up to that CFO level. What else have you learned could help them?
Yeah, one thing I'll touch on, we mentioned self-reflection briefly earlier on, or self-evaluation. I think if someone has designs on becoming a CFO, that's absolutely critical. I think the way you think about your career should always be intentional. If you're kind of a passenger on your career path, you're probably erring in that regard. You should really be thoughtful and intentional about how you forge and develop your career. So from that perspective, I actually heard a methodology from a sports coach a couple of years back, where he had talked about him growing from like a young, new coach into a head coach of a large, well-known sports team. And I try to apply a similar methodology, or think it would be useful to apply a similar methodology to thinking about yourself and growing into being a CFO. And the idea is basically you think of all like the pillars of the skill sets of the role, whether it be a head coach or a CFO, as like a T. So the breadth of skills that you think you need to develop goes across the top of the T. And then as you go deep in certain functional skills, that becomes like the body of the T, right? So for CFOs, the obvious things are, your accounting, finance, FP&A, insurance, capital markets, all the obvious areas in financial leadership roles. But to be in a really effective CFO, particularly on some of the trends that we've talked about earlier, the themes about being ready for the future and broadening yourself, right? Think about things like digital marketing, IT infrastructure, technology transformation, big data, cybersecurity, and maybe they're a little bit further out in the T, and the deepening of that matrix doesn't run as deep as the core finance pillars. But in terms of a self-reflection exercise, I think it's a useful idea to try and map that out. Say you're a finance manager right now, and you think that in 6 years you could be a CFO. Like, study some CFOs that you aspire to, study ones that you look up to, understand what the job requirements are for them, and understand where if they were going to go the extra mile, what are the areas that they think about broadening their skill set to. I just think it's a useful thought exercise for anybody, whether it's for your professional endeavors or personal goal setting, to think through that methodology, and it can be quite useful. And then once you identify the areas where you need to develop yourself, go do it. Today is today, you got to grasp it.
Yeah, and all of that also sounds great in an interview. When you're interviewing for this role and you're telling someone, I've been taking the last few years to learn more about product management, to learn more about performance marketing, to learn more about all these other areas to be a better professional in my lane. It really shines when people say things like that. Any thoughts, Gladys? Or
Yeah. So, I a lot more simple when it comes to about advice for aspiring CFO. I think that, for me, I always make the most in every opportunity. So regardless, good and bad. And I always learn from my mistake, learn from my failure, that how can I be better? And I think the second thing is that really be true, to yourself. There's a lot of CFO out there, but I think that, to really build out the reputation, we have to be staying true to ourselves. And I think the other thing that, I think the other gentleman touched upon is that, step out of the lane, help others learn more about product development. I think those are all crucial. I think for me is to build relationship outside of the accounting and finance team, and to show support, in all levels of the organization, to build rapport. I think that is building the trust is really something that, I see that is really crucial, for a CFO to be successful. And the other thing is to really have critical thinking. I always tell myself that, we need to make a best decision for the company, not just for finance, but it has to be the best for the company. So having the independent judgment and critical thinking are also something crucial, that I embrace, all CFO to have that mindset. And then last is just to be flexible. I think I touched upon that, with the economy constantly changing, we just have to be really adaptable and to have the willingness, to embrace change.
I like that, particularly that portion about embracing change, since we're all going to have to do that, whether we like it or not. Let's jump into the next one, which is perfect for this next question. What is the change that you've all had to do over the last, let's say, 6 to 9 months, and that you forecast and predict you'll have to do for the next year or two? As no one knows exactly what's going to happen. There's a lot of predictions. I read the other day that someone was predicting the bottom is going to drop mid 2024, but people are making all kinds of different predictions. So what do you do in your roles? You're the ones this is like your all time to shine. Everyone's looking to you for what to do next, for the next year. So what do you do?
Well, I can speak first. I think that in terms of things that we as a CFO have taken is to, first of all, I am always in constant contact, with our board, with our management team, with the financial backers, with the investors, because we need to continuously get funding to make sure that we have enough cash to sustain the downturn. So be in constant contact is my first must to do, is to make sure that I talk about the positive and negative about the financials, make sure that all the stakeholders are on board, so that we can build the trust and we can all trying to solve the problems together. So that's one thing that I have done in the current economy. And I think that the other thing that I have done is that not just with the recent economic uncertainty, just with anytime, being a CFO, I always build our financial plan to really talk about, our organization short-term and long-term financial goals, to really address about the risk, of the company. And, I update a financial plan constantly because the variables are constantly changing. We may add on new revenue streams. We may have to take a look at our expenses. So being flexible and being able to constantly update a financial plan and inform the stakeholders about where we are really crucial, not just right now, but in all times. The other thing that we're doing right now is to reduce expenses, to preserve the cash, to extend the runway. We have to look into basically all elements in the organization, how we can scale the company, while cutting the expenses, and how do we allocate the capital effectively so we can yield the best return on investment. The other thing is to really build our cash reserve. With all my companies, I always build out a minimum cash reserve that I must hold. That is the level I cannot go below. And I make it very clear with all the stakeholders that we need to make sure that, there's always going to be variables, that's always going to be changes in the economy, but that is always going to be a cushion that I need to maintain, no matter where we are, no matter where the economy is going to be. The last thing is to, really stay on top of the financial news. Really understand, how is the economy going to impact, the company's financial stability. And I think that, and being in constant contact with our financial stakeholders, investors, and the board are something that we need to do in the current economic uncertainty times.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
really
It's
like
clearly
that.
something you've been thinking about for a little bit too. So I can see this is how you're preparing.
I like that. I think what it also makes clear is that everything Gladys said there is in a time like this, it just throws into clearer focus how much is going on that you can't really control as a company, as an individual. And you kind of want to react to that by increasing the focus on the things that you do control. You want to strengthen your balance sheet. You want to strengthen your business model. You want to make sure you're using this as an opportunity to make changes that otherwise would have taken you years more, would have taken you much more effort to get buyback, because people are more receptive to doing things that de-risk the business. And that's an opportunity, I think, as a finance leader, you do not want to miss. The other thing that's important, I'd say, is especially in times like this, do what you can to help make sure that the rest of the company is not operating out of fear, because that is debilitating. That's bad for growth. That's bad for anything. It's be as transparent as you can, tell people what your constraints are, what the company's constraints are, but within that, allow people to operate without fear.
I like that. Yeah. Operating without fear. Yeah, I was not expecting that answer. It's almost like you see the articles coming from a lot of the investors that are telling you to operate with fear. Like freak out, do everything you can, slash and burn. But I like your approach a lot better. And I think everyone who would work in an organization with you, Hari, would enjoy that approach a lot more. I
think you should do everything you can. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. You should do everything you can to focus on the things that you can change, but do it without leaving people on tenterhooks that things are going to change with them every single day. Be transparent. I think without that, if there's too much uncertainty, everything gets paralyzed. I've seen that happen before, and it's not good.
That makes sense. You can take the actions, but do it with thoughtfulness and with good communication and not being flippant and borderline insane. So I think that's helpful. We are coming up on time here. I do want to thank all of the panelists. I know I learned a lot today. And if I'm going to walk away with anything, it's going to be that cash is king. So thank you, Hari. Thank you, Shane. And thank you, Gladys. And thanks to all the panelists for tuning in here. And again, as Casey had mentioned earlier, we're going to be recording this, sending it out. And so when we do, feel free to share it across the web. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks for hosting, Anish.
Thank you so much for having us. Bye.